There is a name in this city people don't say above a whisper, and the man who owns it is standing in a cold room at 7 in the morning, deciding how much of another man's life to leave him. Rafael Cassano hasn't raised his voice. He hasn't stood up. He turns a page in a ledger and lets the sound of the sea working the rocks below the house do the part of the job that other men would use their fists for. And across the desk, the bookmaker named Pharaoh is sweating through a good coat and shredding the brim of his own hat without knowing his hands are doing it. Everyone in the harbor fears the Cassano name. And in 9 days, a girl in a borrowed coat is going to come up the service drive of this house carrying one small bag and keeping her eyes on the ground. And Rafael is going to look down at her from the 2nd floor and decide in half a breath that she is no one. It will be the single most expensive mistake he ever makes, and he won't understand how expensive until it has already taken him apart and built something new out of the pieces. "Sit," Rafael said. "I'd rather stand, Don Cassano, if it's all the—" "Sit." He still hadn't looked up. Pharaoh sat. Nico leaned in the doorway with his arms folded and watched, because watching Rafael handle a man was the only school he'd ever needed. 2 of the older soldiers stood close behind Pharaoh's chair, near enough that the bookmaker could feel the warmth coming off them, and that was the whole point, warmth where a man wants distance. Rafael let another page turn. When he finally lifted his eyes, they were the flat brown of river water in the shade, and there was nothing behind them a man could get his hands into and pull. "You have a daughter," Rafael said. He said it the way another man might mention the tide. "She's at the school on Vine. She wears her hair in 2 braids that come loose by the afternoon because whoever does them in the morning is in a hurry. She stops at the bakery on the way home, the one with the cinnamon roll in the window. She never buys it. She just stands there and looks at it, and then she walks the rest of the way home." He closed the ledger without hurry. "You didn't know I knew that." Pharaoh made a sound, like a door that needed oil. "I'm telling you what I know so you understand there is no corner of your life I can't reach into." Rafael set both hands flat on the desk. "You have until Friday to bring me what you took. Do that and I forget your name, which is the most generous thing that will ever happen to you. Fail and I won't touch the girl. I'll take the rest. The school, the bakery, the street she walks, the roof over both of you. I'll strip it all away one piece at a time until she's standing in the middle of the world with nothing left to hold on to except her father, and then she'll finally understand exactly what he is." He tipped his chin at the door. "Go home, kiss her good night, do the arithmetic." They took Pharaoh out. Nico stayed. For a moment the study held nothing but the sea and the tick of the old radiator as the heat came up through the pipes. "You didn't have to tell him about the bakery," Nico said. "No," Rafael was already looking at the water. "I didn't." He didn't explain, because there was no explaining it in a way that wouldn't cost him something. Once, 5 years ago, there had been a version of Rafael Cassano who would have found a warmer road to the same place, who would have leaned on the man without ever mentioning the child. That version was in the ground beside his wife. What walked around in his skin now had learned a single hard lesson and built its whole life on it. Mercy is a door. Every door is a way for grief to come back in through the wall you thought you'd sealed. So he had closed all of them and burned the frames, and he intended to go on exactly like this, hollow and armored and safe, until the day someone finally managed to kill him. He was 39. He had made his peace with the arrangement. That was the state of the man on the morning everything started, though the thing that started it was still 9 days out, on a train, watching the city come up out of the water through a dirty window. The house sat on a spit of rock where the harbor met the open water, 4 floors of pale stone behind a wall, and it ran on schedules the way a warship runs on watches. Rafael woke before the sun. He swam the black length of the pool in the east wing until his shoulders were on fire, because pain he chose himself was the only pain the arrangement let him feel. He wore dark colors and no jewelry except a watch that had been his father's. He ate nothing before noon. He kept a study over the water where men came to him with the kind of problem that has no legal shape, and he solved them, and he was very good at it, and none of it touched him anymore, which he counted as strength. There were sparrows all over the house. Small ones, carved from pale scrap wood, sitting on window ledges and mantels and the corners of shelves, dozens of them, worn smooth by handling, some of them thick with dust because no one was allowed to move them and no one could quite bring themselves to clean them either. The staff had learned not to touch the birds. A new girl had lifted one off a sill her first week, 2 years back, only to dust under it, and Rafael had walked in and gone so still and so quiet that she'd put it back with shaking hands and asked Renata for a transfer to another house the same afternoon. He never said why. No one in that house said the word Arya out loud. But the birds stayed exactly where his wife had left them, and the man who could reach into any corner of any life in the city could not make himself move one wooden sparrow a single inch, and that was the truth of him that the ledgers and the debtors never saw. There was one man in the house Rafael trusted the way you trust the floor. His name was Emilio Barcenti, and he had been part of the family longer than Rafael had been alive. He'd been the old man's oldest friend, his consigliere, and when Rafael's father died in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms, it was Emilio who had stood behind the boy at the graveside, and over the years that followed, taught him how to be feared. Emilio was near 70 now, silver-haired, soft in the voice, with a gardener's thick hands. He pruned the roses along the seawall himself, every morning when the weather allowed, because a man ought to keep at least one thing alive with his own 2 hands, he liked to say, and everyone in that house loved him or gave him the nearest thing the house allowed, which was trust with no bottom to it. On the morning Pharaoh left the study, Emilio was in the garden with his shears, and a soldier came down the path to him fast and low and murmured something at his shoulder. Nico, watching from the terrace above, saw the old man listen without pausing his work, saw him take the head off a spent rose with one clean cut, saw him say 4 or 5 words back without looking up. The soldier went white and walked away quickly. Emilio moved to the next cane and studied it, tilting his head, patient, and then he snipped it too. Whatever the man had brought him, whatever the old man had answered, it went into the same soil as the roses and left no mark on his face at all, and Nico thought nothing of it, because everyone had stopped truly looking at Emilio Barcenti decades ago, which was the exact thing that had kept the old man breathing all these years. Rafael came out onto the terrace, with coffee he wasn't drinking. "You've a face on you," Emilio said without turning around. "Pharaoh." "Pharaoh will pay or he won't." Rafael watched the water. "He'll pay." "He'll pay." Emilio straightened up and turned, wiping the shears on a cloth, smiling the warm, slow smile that the whole house trusted. "You were gentle with him, I can always tell. You get quiet when you're being merciful." He tucked the cloth into his pocket. "Your father was the other way, he got loud. You're the better animal, Rafael, you always were, even as a boy. It's a shame the work never lets a man show it." He came up the path and put one thick hand on the younger man's shoulder, the way he'd done 10,000 times, and squeezed once. "Go easy on yourself today. That's an old man's whole advice." Rafael let the hand rest there. He didn't know why it sat a half-second too long in his awareness that morning, a small wrongness he couldn't have named if you'd held a light to it, gone before he could turn and look at it straight. He put it down to the bad sleep. He always put it down to the bad sleep. He drank the cold coffee and went inside, and Emilio watched him go, and the warm smile stayed on the old man's mouth for exactly as long as it took the door to close, and then it wasn't there anymore, and he looked out at the water with something else on his face entirely, and there was no one on the terrace to see it. 9 days later. The girl came. Renata ran the household staff, the way a warden runs a wing, and she'd hired the new one only because the agency swore the girl came with no history worth the telling, which in that house counted as a glowing reference. The papers gave the name Mara Voss, 26 years old, no family listed. She had a way of standing very still and then crossing a room all at once, no motion spent on nothing, and Renata, who had watched 100 girls come and go through the service door, filed that away without being able to say why it bothered her. "You'll take the upper floors," Renata told her at the long kitchen table, sliding a ring of keys across the wood. "You do not enter the study unless it's empty and I've sent you. You do not speak to Don Cassano unless he speaks to you first, and you pray to whatever you pray to that he doesn't. You'll wear soft shoes. In this house the thing you learn to be is furniture." She kept 2 fingers on the keys a moment before she let them go. "The men who come here are not gentlemen." If one of them puts his hands on you, you don't scream and you don't run. You come to me and I make it stop. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, Signora." The girl picked up the keys and closed them into her palm so they didn't jangle. "You're not frightened," Renata said. The girl looked up, and it was the first time Renata had seen her eyes with nothing over them, dark and level and older than the rest of her by a long way. "I've worked worse places," Mara said. There was no pity in it for herself, only the flat report of a fact, and under the fact was something Renata couldn't get her fingers around and didn't like the shape of. There were tells for anyone in that house who'd been the sort of person to read them, and there was exactly one such person, and she just handed Mara the keys and gone back to her lists. When the cook dropped a copper pot, the whole kitchen jumped, and Mara didn't. She had already turned toward the sound before the pot finished falling, her weight rolling forward onto the balls of her feet, one hand lifting an inch off the table and stopping there, and then she'd made herself go loose and slow, a beat too late, covering a thing she hadn't meant to let out. When Renata walked her through the house and pointed out the doors the staff were meant to use, Mara had already found the ones nobody mentioned, the narrow service stair behind the linen room, the door in the boot room that led out onto the seawall, the small window in the third-floor bath that gave onto the flat roof of the garage. She counted them the way you count exits, without appearing to count anything. In the long gallery, where the family's paintings hung under their own small lamps, Renata mentioned that the big dark seascape was a Genoese master worth more than the walls that held it, and Mara said, without slowing the cloth in her hand, "It's a copy. The real one has a fishing boat, lower left. You can see the ghost of it in a raking light where the master painted it out and thought better of it. Whoever hung this knew it was a copy and hung it anyway." Then she caught herself and lowered her eyes and added, "My last house collected. You pick things up." Renata looked at the back of the girl's neck for a long moment and said nothing and wrote it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to act on. Mara kept an object in the left pocket of her apron, all day, every day. Something small, carved from pale wood, worn to a shine on its edges by exactly the touch she gave it when she thought no one was near, 3 fingers closing around it and holding it a moment and letting it go. She never once took it out where a soul could see the shape of it. She had come to that house to kill Rafael Cassano. She had 9 days on the clock and a plan for each of them, and by the end of the first day, she was already half a step behind, because the man was harder to get near than she'd been told, and because a 7-year-old had found her in a corridor and taken her hand and would not let it go. The child's name was Paya. Her mother cooked the second meals and lived in the staff wing, and Paya had the free run of the servants' half of the house and a genius for turning up where she was least wanted. She attached herself to Mara on the first afternoon with the whole and unreasoning faith small children hand out and never explain, trailing her from room to room, narrating the world. "That's the cold room, nobody goes in there. That's where the men sit and it smells like smoke. That door's always locked." Paya tipped her chin at the study as they passed and dropped her voice into a stage whisper that carried the length of the corridor. "You're not supposed to look at him. Renata says he hasn't got a heart." "But that's a lie, because last winter my mama got sick and couldn't work and nobody put us out, and the doctor came 3 whole times, and it was him that paid for it. Only you're not supposed to know, so don't say." She swung on Mara's hand like it was a gate. "Will you do my hair like yours, with the plait down the side?" Mara looked down at her. For a moment something in her face came unlatched, and then she put it away where she kept everything. "Sit on the step," she said. "Hold still." She was plaiting a 7-year-old's hair on the back stair when Rafael came around the corner, and that was the first time. He was moving fast, on his way to the garage with Nico and 2 of the men, and he stopped when he saw them, because a man who has trained himself to notice everything can't help but catch a thing out of place, and a maid taking her time over a child, in that house of hard clocks, was as out of place as a bird in a boardroom. He didn't say anything at first. He stood at the top of the stair and looked down, and Mara felt the light change and turned her head and met his eyes for exactly 1 second before she remembered to drop them. 1 second. It was enough. He had spent 5 years unable to feel his own pulse, walking around the inside of himself like a man through an empty building at night. And in that 1 second, something under his ribs gave a single hard knock once, a fist on a wall he'd bricked shut with his own hands. It was gone as fast as it came. He didn't understand it, and he didn't like the size of it, and his face gave away not 1 degree of it. "You," he said, "you're the new one." "Yes, Don Cassano." She kept her eyes on the child's hair. Her hands didn't stop and they didn't shake. That was wrong too. Everyone's hands shook. "What's your name?" "Myra." He held on the top of her bent head a moment longer than the question needed. Paya, who was afraid of nobody living, tipped her face all the way back and beamed up at him upside down. "She knows if a painting's real," Paya announced to the ceiling. "She told Renata the boat one's a fake and Renata went funny about it." Something moved at the corner of Rafael's mouth and stopped before it turned into anything a person could name. He looked at the top of Mara's head, at the neat, fast work of her fingers. "Did she?" he said. Then he went down the stair, past the 2 of them, close enough that the wool of his coat brushed the wall an inch from her shoulder, and out to the car, and he was gone the rest of the day. But in the back of the car, watching the drive unwind behind them, he found himself turning the maid over in his mind the way you turn a stone that doesn't match any other stone in the wall. A maid who knew what a pentimento was. A maid whose hands stayed level with a killer's coat brushing past her. He told himself it was nothing. He was a man who ran down every irregularity because irregularities were the exact things that got a man like him buried. And he would run this one to the ground, and it would come up nothing, and that would be the end of it. He was lying to himself, and being a man of rare discipline, he could do it with a perfectly straight face. But the pulse that had been dead in him for 5 years had started, very quietly, to keep a schedule, and the schedule had her name on it. That night, alone in his dark rooms with a glass he didn't touch, he stood at the window over the black water and thought about a pair of level eyes, and hated that he was thinking about them, and went on thinking about them anyway. She was thinking about him too, 3 floors down, in a narrow bed in the staff wing, but she was thinking about the angle of the study door, and the guards on the terrace and the window of his rooms she'd already found the line of sight to from the garage roof. She lay on her back with her hands folded on her chest, one of them around the carved bird, and she ran the house again from the top, the way she'd been taught to run a house since she was 13 years old. And she made herself not think about the way the man had said did she, with that thing almost happening at the corner of his mouth. Because the way a target's mouth moved was not information a blade was permitted to keep. She'd never had a target with a face before. That was the thing she couldn't say to anyone, because there was no one to say it to. She'd had 11 years of a voice on a phone and men who trained her and left before she could learn their names, and one story, told to her so many times it had grown into the walls of her, about a monster called Cassano who had murdered everyone she'd ever belonged to, and she was the blade the fire had left behind to cut him down. She had made herself into a locked and loaded thing for this. She had kept her heart shut so tight for so long that at 26 she had never once let herself want a single living person, because the voice had taught her that wanting was a leak, and a leak drowned the whole job. And so she was untouched in the one way the world would never think to check. A woman who had made herself a stranger to her own softness, so that no one could ever get a hand on it and turn it. She had walked into this house sealed. She had also walked into the house of the man who saved her life, though she didn't know that yet, and neither did he, and the truth was going to sit between them for a long time yet, wearing an apron, carrying a wooden bird in its pocket, waiting for everything to come down before either of them could see it plain. The test started small, because Rafael was not a man who could feel a thing without needing to master it, and he could not master what he didn't understand, so he set about understanding her the only way he had, which was pressure. He moved his morning coffee to the small east room, where the upper floor maid would have to pass, and he timed it so that she did. He told himself he was watching a possible risk to the house. He was, in the way a man watches the one door in the room he can't stop looking at. On the 3rd morning he was standing at the east room window when she came through with an armful of linen, and he said, without turning, "You, the seascape, come show me the fake." She could have played the fool. A smart operative always plays the fool, but she'd already made her mistake with Renata and couldn't take it back, and she'd learned one more thing about this man in 3 days, that he punished the smell of a lie worse than he punished the truth. So she set the linen on a chair and walked with him into the gallery, and she showed him. She stood close to the canvas and pointed without touching it. There, under the varnish in the dark water, that paler shape. A boat the master started and painted over. The oil's gone a little transparent with age, so the thing he buried is coming back up to the surface. She stepped back from it. A forger copies what he can see. He can't copy the thing that's underneath because he doesn't know it's there. Whoever sold you this counted on you never looking at your own wall long enough to catch it. People don't look at what they already own. They stop seeing it the day it's theirs. Rafael was looking at her, not the painting. No, he said, they don't. He should have let it end there. He couldn't. Something in him needed to find the ordinary, frightened girl under the level eyes, because if she was ordinary, then the knock under his ribs was nothing and he could brick it over again and go back to being safe. So he did the thing he did to men. The quiet cruelty. The door with the trap set behind it. My uncle tells me the agency sent you because you've got no family, he said, watching the side of her face. No one to write to, no one to ask after you, no one who'd so much as notice if you didn't come home one night. He let that lie in the cold air between them. A girl alone in a house full of the kind of men who come here. You ought to be more frightened than you are, Mara. Why aren't you frightened of me? And she looked at him, and for half a second the truth pressed hard against the back of her teeth, the whole of it. I'm not frightened of you because I came here to end you, and there's no leverage in the world you can put on a woman who's already decided she'll die doing it. What she said instead was low and even and, in its own way, just as true. Because you're the first person in this house who's looked at me like I'm a real thing, and not the furniture. Which landed somewhere in Rafael that he'd sealed off years ago, and he felt the seal shift, and he turned and walked out of the gallery without another word, because he didn't trust his own face to hold the line for one more second in front of her. That was the shape of the first week. He circled and he pressed. She held and did not break, and every day the thing he was trying to kill in himself grew instead, because she was the single variable in his controlled and frozen life that he could not solve, and a man who cannot solve a thing will either smash it or fall into it, and he could not, for the life of him, make himself smash her. She had a war of her own. She'd found the line of sight to his rooms. She'd mapped the guards' rotation on the terrace and the 2 blind minutes between them. She'd chosen 3 ways to do the job and a way out from each. She could have done it on the 4th night. He kept a glass of water on the table by his bed, and he slept with the door unlocked because he feared nothing under his own roof, which was the last honest confidence the arrangement had left him. She stood in his corridor at 3 in the morning with the means in her hand, and her pulse as slow as the voice had trained it to be, and she looked at the shape of him asleep in the low light, the only time the hardness came off his face, the only time you could see the man the old gardener had meant when he said the better animal, and she found that her feet would not carry her across the sill. She stood there until the guard rotation closed the window, and then she went back to her narrow bed and lay on her back and told herself it was tactics. The file was too clean. The house was too awake. She needed more time. She was lying to herself with the same straight face he used, and she was every bit as good at it, and the 2 of them, without either knowing it, were buying each other the exact days that were going to take them both apart. What cracked the pattern open was a sick child at the seawall gate. There was a boy the house looked after, quietly, not Paya, a soldier's son named Leo who lived with an aunt across the city because his father had died 3 years back in Rafael's service. Rafael paid for the boy the way he paid for Paya's mother, without a word said, and without letting it be known, and the boy worshipped the man whose money he wasn't allowed to understand. One gray afternoon, the aunt brought Leo to the seawall gate because the child had a fever the free clinic couldn't touch, and she was out of pride and out of anywhere else to go. And Rafael was in the garden with Emilio when they came, and Mara was at the upstairs window with a cloth in her hand, watching the water, and so she watched all of it. She watched Rafael Cassano, the name the city said in whispers, go down onto his heels on the wet path to put himself at a 9-year-old's eye level. She watched him lay the back of his hand against the boy's forehead the way a father does it, an old reflex the arrangement had never quite managed to freeze out of him. She watched him take off his own coat, the dark coat that grown men shredded their hats over, and wrap it around the shaking child, and she watched him say something low that made the boy, who'd been crying, laugh once, wetly, through it. Then he stood and gave Nico an address, and the name of a doctor and a fold of money, and told the aunt the boy would be seen inside the hour. And when the woman tried to thank him, he cut her off, not unkindly, and told her to go on now, and the whole of it took a minute and a half, and he never once let his face soften where a person could see it, except that a person did see it, from a window 3 floors up, through glass. And the certainty she had built her entire life on cracked, straight down the middle in the space of 90 seconds. Because the man she had been made to kill had just wrapped his coat around a sick boy on a wet path, and monsters did not do that, and there was no room in the story she'd been raised on for a monster who did that, and the story was the only floor she had ever stood on, and it had just gone soft under her feet. She stepped back from the window fast, as if the glass had turned hot. Her hand was in her apron pocket and around the carved bird before she knew she'd moved it. She stood in the empty upstairs room with her back against the wall and did a thing she had not done since she was 13 years old and had learned it changed nothing. She let her eyes fill. Then she blinked it down hard twice because feeling was a leak and she had a job and the job did not care in the slightest that the target had a heart. She told herself she'd been shown a performance. Rich men bought goodwill by the yard. It meant nothing. She almost believed it. Almost. The crack down the middle of her stayed open, and a thin, cold draft came through it that she couldn't stop, and she stood there a long time before her hands were steady enough to go back to work. Down in the garden, Emilio had watched the whole thing too, and where Mara's face had come apart, the old man's had gone thoughtful, which on Emilio Barcenti was a far more dangerous thing. He'd spent 5 years keeping Rafael frozen. A frozen man makes no heirs, takes no new wife, forms no fresh alliance, softens toward no one who might stand behind him and inherit his weight. And a frozen man, when at last he dies with a clean line of succession running straight to the loyal old friend who grieves the loudest at the graveside. Emilio watched Rafael watch the sick boy carried away, and then he lifted his eyes, slow, to a certain 3rd-floor window where a curtain had just moved. And he stood among his roses with the shears loose in his hand and began, very quietly, to do arithmetic of his own. "You've gone somewhere, old man," Rafael said, coming back up the path. "I'm old," Emilio said, and the warm, slow smile came up over whatever had been underneath it. "Going somewhere is most of what's left to me." He fell into step. "The new girl, Renata's upper maid, you've noticed her." Rafael's face didn't change, which to Emilio, who had raised him from a hard boy into a harder man, was as good as a signed confession. "She knows things a maid shouldn't," Rafael said. "Her file's too clean. I'm watching her." "Good." Emilio said it with all the warmth in the world, and something behind the warmth went to ice, because Rafael watching her was the single thing on earth Emilio least wanted, and the old man understood, in that moment on the path, that the clock he'd been running for 5 years had just broken its spring. "A man in your seat can't be too careful, Rafael. You know that better than anyone. Let me look into her myself. I've still got a few old friends who owe me. I'll have the truth of her by the end of the week, quiet, no fuss, and if she's nothing you'll never have wasted a thought on it." "No," Rafael said. "I'll handle it." "I'll handle it." Emilio kept the smile firmly in place all the way to the door, and behind it he made a decision he had been holding in reserve for a long time, which was that his blade had gone slow in the girl's hand, and a slow blade is a liability, and a liability gets corrected. That night, in a room no one watched him enter, the old man sat down and wrote 3 words, in his own careful hand, and sent them down a channel 11 years old to a girl who had checked it out of habit every single day of her life, and the 3 words were "finish it now." She was in the linen room when the message reached her the way they always had, a folded scrap left where only she would think to look, and she opened it and read "finish it now," and her hands went still on the sheet she'd been folding. Around her the house made its evening sounds, the pipes, the far-off kitchen, Paya's laugh from somewhere below. She stood there and thought about the carved bird in her pocket, and the coat around the boy, and the man asleep with his door unlocked who looked, for those few hours a night, like a person. And she thought, with a clarity that put more fear into her than any threat the voice had ever sent, I don't want to. It was the most dangerous thought she had ever had, and the instant she'd had it she could not put it back, and she was still standing over the folded sheet with the scrap in her hand when the house came apart around her. It came at 2:10 in the morning, and it was made to look like a rival's work, and it was Emilio's. The old man had done the arithmetic and hated the answer and moved anyway. He needed Rafael afraid again, needed the house on a war footing, needed his blade to have a clean reason to be near the target with a weapon in her hand, and no one thinking twice about it. He'd paid 4 men to hit the seawall side of the estate, put 2 of Rafael's soldiers down, make a great deal of noise, and die on the rocks if it came to it. He'd told Mara nothing, because he wanted her improvising, and a girl who saves the target's life by killing a man in the dark can get closer to that target in one night than a maid can get in a month of mornings. The old man was moving her like a piece on a board he'd been setting for 11 years, and he was very good at it, and he had made one mistake, the same mistake Rafael had made, which was to forget that the piece was a person. It was going to be the last mistake he ever made. He just didn't know it yet. The first Mara knew of it was the sound. Glass going in, and then the flat cough of a suppressed weapon, and then men moving through the house where no men should have been. She was out of the narrow bed and dressed in the dark in the time it takes most people to sit up and understand they're awake. She did not think about the job. She thought about Paya, whose small room was on the same wing as the breaking glass, and she was already moving toward the child before her mind had finished making the choice. And that, more than anything, told her exactly who she had become in 9 days, and she promised herself she would examine it later if there was a later. The house woke into violence. Rafael was in the corridor in seconds with a weapon up and Nico at his shoulder, and the 2 of them went toward the breach the way men go who have done it before, low and fast, and without a word wasted. But there were more men in the dark than a warning should have carried, and one of them had come up the narrow service stair behind the linen room, the one nobody talked about, the one Mara had mapped on her first day in the house, and he came up it silent and quick, and he came up behind Rafael in the black corridor where Nico's angle couldn't find him, and his weapon was already rising toward the back of the Don's skull. And Mara, coming the other way with Paya's small hand crushed in hers, saw it. She had 1 second, the same 1 second that had started all of this, the second on the stair. She could let it happen. Finish it now, the scrap in her pocket said, in the hand of the only father she'd ever had. The man she'd been forged to kill was 3 feet from a bullet, and every part of the 11 years behind her said all you have to do is nothing. Let the job finish itself. Walk out clean in the confusion. Go back to whatever waited on the far side of a thing she'd trained her whole life to reach. All she had to do was stand still for 1 second and let the dark do it for her. She shoved Paya behind her body, drew the flat blade she kept against her spine, and threw herself across the corridor into the man's rising arm as the weapon fired. So the round went high and buried itself in the plaster of the ceiling. And then she did the thing the voice had spent a fortune teaching her. All speed, and no hesitation and no mercy in it anywhere. And it was over in 4 seconds, and the man was down on the runner, and he was not going to get up. And Mara stood in the middle of the corridor with her chest heaving and a dead professional at her feet, and blood not her own across her sleeve. And Rafael Cassano turned around in the dark and looked at her with an expression she had never once seen on his face. The house went still around the 2 of them. Nico had the far end of the corridor, and the last of the noise was dying somewhere below. Paya was crying into the back of Mara's shirt, both small hands fisted in the fabric. And Rafael stood there, weapon still half up, and looked at the maid who had just moved like the most lethal thing in the house, who had a blade in her hand and a dead man at her feet and no shake anywhere in her, and he understood 2 things in the same instant. The first was that everything he had suspected was true and worse than he'd let himself think. The second, and this was the one that finished the frozen man for good, was that she had chosen. She'd had the second. He had seen her have it, seen the whole of it cross her face in the dark, the arithmetic and the choice both, and she had spent that second on him. He lowered the weapon. He crossed the corridor to her slowly, and she held her ground with the dead man between them, chin up, waiting for whatever was coming, a gun or a cell or the truth said out loud, and what came was none of the three. He reached out and, with a care that matched nothing the city said about his hands, took the bloody blade from her fingers. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Who sent you?" he said, and his voice was not cold, and that was the thing that took the floor out from under her, because it came out rough and cracked at the edge, a man's voice when the ground has shifted under his feet. 9 days in my house, moving like that, hiding all of it. You came here for somebody. Say the name." And she couldn't, not to protect the voice on the phone. She couldn't say the name because she stood there in the ringing dark with the boy she'd saved him from at her feet and understood all at once that she did not have it. She had spent her whole life as the weapon of a man whose face she had never seen, and the target had turned out to be a man who wrapped his coat around sick children, and the entire architecture of her life had just come down on top of her, and she stood in the wreck of it with nothing true left to hand him. "I don't know," she said, and it broke. The level voice finally broke all the way through. "I've never seen his face. I've done what he told me my whole life, and I don't even know his name." She was shaking now, and it wasn't the fight. "They sent me here to kill you. That's the truth of it. I've stood over your bed with the door open. And tonight I found out I'd rather die than do it, and I can't tell you why. And it's the most frightened I have ever been in my life, standing here telling you that." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Paya had gone quiet against her back, sensing the size of the thing in the air the way children do without a single word for it. The sea worked the rocks below the house, the same as it had every night, patient, indifferent, taking its slow bites out of the world. Blood cooled on the runner between them. Rafael Cassano, who had not touched a living soul with anything like tenderness in 5 years, lifted his hand and laid it along the side of the maid's face, and she let him. And neither of them had the first idea that they had already known each other since the night she was 13, and the whole city burned a little at the harbor's edge. He got her out of the corridor. He got Nico to clear the last of it and put men on every door. Renata took Paya away, murmuring, and got the child calmed, and by the gray hour before dawn the house was a war camp, soldiers on every landing, the 2 dead men on the seawall side already gone somewhere they'd never be found. And Emilio, roused from his bed like the rest, came down grave and steady and took charge of the sweep with a firm old hand, playing the loyal number 2 to the hilt, moving from room to room, and all the while watching one thing above every other, watching his blade across every doorway, trying to read off the girl's face whether she had broken clean or turned in his hand. He got Rafael alone in the study as the sun came up filthy over the water. 4 men, Emilio said, professionals by the look of them. Someone put a hand on this house tonight and someone will bleed for it, but Rafael, listen to me now. He put his thick hand on the younger man's arm, warm, fatherly, the way he'd done 1,000 times across a lifetime. The girl, she killed one of them, a maid killing a trained man in the dark. You see what I'm telling you? She's inside for a reason. She could be theirs, left here to open a door the night the real hit comes. We have to put her somewhere we control, and we have to open her up, gently, carefully, until we know the whole of her. I've done this kind of thing before. Let me take her off your hands. You've enough to carry without her. And Rafael, who had trusted this man above his own memory for a decade, looked down at the hand on his arm and felt, for the first time in his life, a thin, cold breath of something wrong that he could not put a name to. It was nothing he could hold up to the light. It was the way the old man had said the real hit comes, as though he already knew there'd be one and knew its shape. It was the too smooth speed of the offer to take her away and open her up. It was I've done this kind of thing before, and the ease with which it came out. He filed it, the way she had taught him to file a thing without knowing she had taught him anything at all, and he said, level and quiet, "No, she stays with me. She saved my life tonight, and until I understand why she does not leave my sight and no one lays a hand on her. Are we clear, Emilio?" "Of course," Emilio said, and smiled, and squeezed the arm once and let it go. And behind the smile, something that had waited with enormous patience for 5 long years began, at last, to run out of it. Rafael kept her close, because closeness was the only way he had ever learned a thing all the way down, and he told himself it was custody. He put her in a room down the hall from his own, a guard on the stair, and told the household she was under his protection and the why of it was his own business. The real reason had nothing to do with security, and he knew it. And for the first time in 5 years, he let himself have the thing he wanted anyway, which was that he could not stand for her to be behind any wall that wasn't one of his. The house was still lit up and full of men when he brought her up to the room himself, near dawn, and stood in the doorway while she washed the blood off her hands in the basin, and neither of them said anything for a while. She dried her hands. She turned around. He was leaning in the door frame with his arms folded, watching her the way he'd watched her from the top of the stair on the first day, except there was nothing left in it now that either of them could pretend was only assessment. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." She didn't move toward the bed. "You won't." "No," a muscle worked once at the hinge of his jaw. "I don't much, 5 years now." He said it before he'd decided to, and it surprised him coming out, and he didn't take it back. "You knew where the service stair was, the one they came up. It's not on any plan I've ever shown anyone." "I know where every door in this house is." She held his eyes. "I knew them all by the end of the first day. That's what I am. That's what he made me." Her hand went to her apron pocket and stopped and came away empty, and he watched it do that. "You should be putting me in a cell right now, or worse, any sane man in your seat would." "Probably." He didn't move out of the doorway. "You had the second in the corridor. I saw you have it. You could have let him do it and walked out that boot-room door onto the seawall and been gone before I hit the floor." His voice had gone rough again at the edges, the way it did around her and no one else. "Why didn't you? And don't tell me you don't know, because you know. You've known everything else in this house since the day you walked in it. Why didn't you let him kill me, Mara?" And she stood there in the gray coming up over the water, with a dead man's blood still under her nails where the basin hadn't reached, and she gave him the truest thing she had, which was not an answer but the shape of one. "Because somewhere in the last 9 days I stopped being able to do it," she said low. "And I've been able to do it my whole life. That was the one thing about me that never once bent, and you bent it, and I don't forgive you for it because now I don't know what I am." Her breath went unsteady and she let it. "You were supposed to be a monster. I needed you to be a monster. And you wrapped your coat around that boy on the path like it was nothing, like no one was watching, and I've had nowhere to stand since." For a long moment, the only sound was the sea and the low murmur of the men on the floors below. He didn't cross the room to her. He wanted to, and she saw that he wanted to, and the not crossing sat in the air between them heavier than any touch would have. The whole charged distance of it. Two people who had both spent years making themselves untouchable, and had just found the one person who could reach through the armor, and were both, now, holding perfectly still on either side of it, afraid of what would happen if either of them moved first. "Get some sleep," he said finally, rough, and pushed off the door frame. "There's a guard on the stair. He's there to keep the house out, not to keep you in. If you want to walk out that boot-room door onto the seawall in the morning, no one will stop you. You saved my life. That buys you the door if you want it." He stopped in the hall, his hand on the frame, and didn't look back at her. "I don't want you to want it. That's my problem, not yours. Good night, Mara." And he was gone down the hall to his own dark rooms, and she stood alone in the gray light with her heart doing a thing it had never been permitted to do. And after a while, because she couldn't sleep either, she went to the window that looked back along the seaward wing, and she could see into the corner of his study 1 floor down where a lamp was still burning, and she saw him standing at his own window not sleeping, and she saw, on the sill in front of him, lit gold by the lamp, a small carved wooden bird. She went very still. She had seen the birds all over the house. She dusted around them careful, because Renata had told her the birds did not get moved. She'd thought nothing of them, a rich man's dead wife's little hobby, sad, ordinary. But she had never once seen one in this light, this close, this framed, and now she stood at the window with her own hand going, without any instruction from her, into her apron pocket, and closing around the small carved thing she had carried since she was 13 years old, worn smooth on its edges by 13 years of exactly this. And she took it out at last, where no one could see, and held it up in the gray light coming off the water, and looked from the bird in her own palm to the bird on his sill 1 floor below, and the cold that came up through the crack in her then was not a draft anymore. It was a flood. Because they were the same bird, the same pale wood, the same small knife, the same hand. And she had been told, her whole life, by a voice on a phone, exactly one story about where hers had come from, and standing at that window with the two birds in her sight, she understood, without yet understanding a single thing about how, that the story was a lie, and that the answer to who she really was and what had really happened in the fire, and who had really been holding her strings all these years, was sitting one floor below her on the windowsill of the man she had come to kill. Worn smooth by a grief she had never once imagined might be the mirror of her own. She didn't wait for morning. She went down the seaward stair in her stocking feet with the bird closed in her fist, past the guard who watched her go and said nothing because the dawn had told him she was to have the run of the house, and she came to the study door and found it open a hand's width, lamp still burning, and she stood there a moment with her whole life pressing on the back of her teeth, and then she pushed it wide and went in. Rafael turned from the window. Whatever he saw on her face stopped whatever he'd been about to say. She crossed the room without a word. She came to the sill where Arya's sparrow sat in the lamplight, and she set her own bird down beside it, close, so the two of them stood wing to wing on the old wood, and then she stepped back and folded her arms across herself and waited, because she couldn't make the words yet and she needed him to look. He looked. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at, and then his face did a thing she had never seen a face do. It went slack, and then it went white, and he reached out and touched neither bird, only hovered his fingers over the two of them as if they might not both be real. "Where did you get this?" he said. It came out with no air behind it. "A man gave it to me." Her voice held for exactly that long, and then it started to go. "When I was 13, in a fire." Rafael's hand closed on the edge of the sill. She told him then, and she didn't tell it clean, because there was no clean way left in her. She told him there had been a fire when she was a child, that she remembered a room full of people who loved each other, and light, and then the world coming down, and then dark and weight and no sound because her ears had gone, and she remembered being pinned under something too heavy for a child, screaming and not hearing herself scream. She told him a man had come through the smoke and gotten the weight off her. She didn't know how, that a grown man had lifted a beam a child couldn't move, and that he'd had blood on his face and no words she could hear, and he'd pressed something small and warm into her hand and closed her fingers around it, and she'd read his mouth in the firelight, and his mouth had said, hold on, and then he'd picked her up and carried her toward the light and put her down in the street. And Rafael Cassano was not standing at the window anymore. He was somewhere 5 years back, and it had him, and it was rendered on his face in real time, and the study fell away from both of them. It is a christening at a restaurant on the harbor, the good one with the long windows over the water, and the whole family is there because Arya's cousin has finally had the baby after all those years of hopping, and the room is loud and warm and lit up, glasses and someone's terrible singing, and the baby being handed hand to hand down a long table. Arya is laughing at something across the room. She finds Rafael by the door where he's just come in from the car, and she takes his hand and presses 2 small carved birds into it, still warm from her coat pocket, and she says, "Hold these. I finished them in the car. I'll want them back." And she says it laughing, and she goes in ahead of him into the light and the noise, and he stops for 1 more second in the doorway because a man is holding the door for an old woman with a cane, and Rafael waits to let them through. 1 second, 2. The bird's warm in his closed hand, and that is the whole reason he is alive. 2 seconds of holding a door. Then the front of the building comes apart. He doesn't hear it. That is the thing no one understands who wasn't in it, that the great sounds arrive too big for the ears to take and the ears simply stop. And so it is all silence and pressure and the world turning white and then black, and then the floor is the ceiling. He is on his back in the doorway with the street behind him and the room in front of him on fire, and he can't hear, and his mouth is full of dust, and Arya is in there. Arya went in ahead of him, and he goes in after her. He crawls. The heat is a wall he pushes his body through. The long table is gone, the family is gone, there is fire where the singing was, and he is screaming her name and can't hear it, and he can't find her, and he can't find her, and then his hand closes on a small arm. Not Arya, a child. A girl of 13 with her legs pinned under a fallen beam, her face turned up to him, her mouth wide open, screaming a scream neither of them can hear. Her eyes find his, and they are the most frightened eyes he has ever seen in his life, and he cannot make her hear him. So he gets his shoulder under the beam. "You can do things." A man who has given up on himself in a burning building can do things that break him later, and he lifts it, the beam that shouldn't move. He lifts it off her legs and holds it and shouts at her with his eyes to move. Get out, go, and she scrambles free, and he lets it drop. She won't run. She's too scared or too hurt, and she stands there in the fire shaking and looking at him with those eyes, and he has no words she can hear. He has nothing, and then he remembers his own closed hand, and he opens it, and there are two small wooden birds in his palm, warm from a dead woman's pocket. He takes one and he presses it into the child's hand and closes her fingers over it, the way you give a frightened thing something to hold on to so it doesn't come apart, and he mouths at her, big and slow so she can read it. Hold on, I'm going to get you out. And she reads it. He sees her read it. And he picks her up, all of her, she's light. She weighs nothing, and he carries her through the fire toward the pale place where the wall used to be, and he puts her down on the wet street where the first sirens are coming, where the medics will reach her. And he mouths at her one more time, stay. They'll come for you, stay. And then he turns and goes back in for his wife. They pulled him out the second time. He never reached her. Arya had been at the head of the table, in the chair someone had made sure she'd sit in, and she had been gone since the first white second, before he ever crawled, and there was nothing to reach. He woke in a hospital 3 days later with his hearing half back and his wife 3 days buried without him, and the first coherent thing he did was ask about the child, the girl he'd carried out. Because he had saved one thing in that fire. One, in the middle of losing everything, he had put a living child down in the street with his own hands, and he needed her to be alive. He needed the one thing to have held. There was no child, they told him. No girl had been brought in from the scene. The medics who worked the street had no record of a 13-year-old pulled from the front of the building. He described her, the eyes, the arm, the bird he'd put in her hand, and they looked at him with the careful faces people use on a man who lost his wife 3 days ago and has a head injury, and they told him there was no girl, Don Cassano, there was no one there. And so, over the months that followed, as the framed man went to prison and the city moved on and Rafael turned himself to stone, he had folded that too into the loss. She'd died in the chaos, or she'd been carried off by someone and died elsewhere, or, on the worst nights, she had never existed at all. A dying man's dream, his mind's mercy giving him one person to have saved so he wouldn't have to know he'd saved no one. For 5 years he had believed one of those 3 things, and had carried the second bird in his pocket, the twin, the last thing Arya's hands ever made, warm from him now the way it had once been warm from her, and he had grieved a wife and a phantom child both, and told no one about the child because to say her out loud was to have someone tell him again, gently, that she was never real. The study came back. The lamp, the water, the 2 birds wing to wing on the sill. Mara had stopped talking. She was watching his face come back from wherever it had gone, and she had seen enough of it move to understand that he had been where she had been, on the same night, in the same fire, and the flood that had started at the window came all the way up. It was you, she said. It was barely sound. The man who carried me out, it was you. Rafael tried to speak and nothing came. He tried again. What came out was in pieces and he let it because polish would have been a lie and he had no lies left for her. You were real. His hand was shaking against the sill. 5 years, they told me. They told me there was no girl that I didn't. He stopped. His jaw worked and nothing came and then it did. I put you down in the street. I told you to stay. I went back for her and when I came out you were gone and they said you were never there and I thought I dreamed you. I thought I stood in that fire and saved a dream because I couldn't save my wife. His eyes were wet and furious and lost all at once. You're the girl. You've been alive this whole. You've been. He couldn't finish it. He looked at her the way a man looks at the dead come back, and then the second thing hit him, and it took the color out of him all over again. You came here to kill me. They told me you did it. She was crying now, 13 years of it coming up at once, and she didn't wipe it away. The man who raised me, the voice on the phone. He told me a monster named Cassano murdered my family in that fire, and that the man who carried me out was your man, planting a story to make me trust the name, and that the bird was the lie, and I should keep it and hate it so I'd never forget what I survived for. He told me that when I was 13 years old with my whole family in the ground and nowhere on earth to go, and I believed him, because he was the only thing I had. Her voice cracked all the way through. I've hated this bird for 13 years. I've carried the only kind thing anyone ever did for me in my apron pocket and hated it every single day because a man told me to. And it was you. You saved my life, and I've spent that life training to take yours, and the person who pointed me at you took me off that street. Rafael went very still. She watched the grief on his face go through something and come out the other side as a thing much harder and much older, and she understood that they had both, in the same second, arrived at the same cold question, because they were both, under everything, the kind of person who arrived there. Someone took you off the street, he said, and his voice had steadied into something flat and terrible. Before the medics reached you, that night, someone was there fast enough to take a child out of the front of a bombing before the first responders and knew there was a child to take and knew what to do with her. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the middle distance where the whole architecture of 5 years was rearranging itself. The man they arrested, his name was Renzo Marchetti. Rival family, old grudge, the case was clean, too clean, the evidence walked us right to him inside a week. His hand flattened on the sill. Who told me to look at Marchetti, who had the old friends who put the case together so fast, who sat with me after and told me every day for a month that the way to survive was to feel nothing and trust no one. His breath went out of him slow. No one. He said trust no one, and he said it holding my arm, the way he's held my arm my whole life. Mara had gone cold. Rafael. Somebody wanted my wife dead badly enough to bomb a room full of her family to reach her chair, he said. And when I didn't break, when I went to stone instead of into the ground behind her, they didn't stop. They found the child from the scene, the one they'd taken, and they raised her into a slower knife, and they've spent 5 years and God knows what waiting for that knife to reach me. That's a man who's been inside my life the whole time, who knew this house well enough to put you in it, who knew my grief well enough to know a frozen man makes no air and can be inherited from clean. He turned and looked at her, and there was no color left in him at all. Who profits, Mara? If I die with no one standing behind me and a loyal old friend to weep at the grave and take the chair, who has spent 5 years keeping me frozen, whose hands do I trust above my own memory? And down along the seawall, in the gray coming up over the water, an old man knelt at his roses with a pair of shears, and he had not slept either, and he had felt the house change under him the way you feel weather coming in your bones before the sky shows it. And Emilio Barcenti took the head off a spent bloom with one clean cut, and understood that his blade had turned all the way in his hand, and was pointing back at him now, and that he had perhaps a day. And then he did the arithmetic he had been avoiding for 5 years, and stopped avoiding it. He did not run. A man does not survive 50 years in that world by running when the wind changes. He did the other thing, the thing patient and cruel men do when patience finally fails them, and he did it before the sun was fully up. He took the one thing he was certain they would both come apart to protect, because a man who has spent his life reading grief knows exactly where the soft places are and how to press them. He took Paya. It was quiet and it was clean, and by the time the house woke to it, there was only the child's empty bed and her mother's screaming in the kitchen and a single sheet of paper left on the seawall among the roses, in Emilio's own careful hand. The old barn at the north edge of the property. First light tomorrow. Rafael alone, no soldiers. Or the child answers for the sins of the people who love her. And beneath that, one more line, and this line was not for Rafael. Finish what you were made for. 3 words she had read 100 times in her life in the voice she had known as the only father she had, and reading them now in his own hand, knowing at last whose hand it was, finished the last thing in her that had still belonged to him. He was still, even at the end, trying to work her like a piece on his board. He had raised her to obey those words. He was betting his life she would. He had made her into a weapon. It was the last mistake he ever made, because he had forgotten that a weapon, once it understands whose hand has been on it all along, can always choose which way to turn. Rafael read the note and was already moving, already reaching for a coat and a gun, already the man who would walk into a barn alone and trade himself for a child, and Mara stopped him with one hand flat on his chest. No, she said, not the way he's drawn it. He wants you to come alone and afraid and unarmed, and he wants me to do the one thing I've always done, which is kill whatever he points me at. He built this for the 2 of us. He's been building it for 11 years. Her eyes were dry now, and level, the eyes that had put a cold feeling into Renata on the first day, and Rafael saw the thing he'd glimpsed in the corridor with the dead man at her feet, the most lethal thing in any room, and it was on his side now, and it was a hard thing to look at. He raised me to be the last knife you never see. He forgot I know that knife better than he ever did. Let me be it one more time, for her, and for your wife. There was no version of Rafael Cassano that would let a woman walk alone into a barn to face the man who'd murdered his wife. There was no version of the girl the fire had made that would let this be anyone's fight but hers. They came to the arrangement two people come to when they have finally found each other, and neither will spend the other, which was that they went together, but not the way the old man had it drawn. First light came gray and hard over the Northfield, frost standing white on the grass, and the barn sat black against it with one door open like a mouth. Emilio was inside with the child and 3 men, the last 3 who took his money over the family's blood, and he had put Paya on a bale in the middle of the floor where the light from the open door would fall on her, because he had staged things for 50 years and he understood staging, and he waited for Rafael to walk into the frame alone and unarmed and ready to die, so that the old man could kill him there with the child watching and call it a rival's work and grieve loudest at the graveside and take the chair. What came through the door was Rafael, alone, hands open and empty, walking slow, exactly as ordered, exactly as staged. And Emilio smiled because his read on the boy had held, because grief made men into things you could predict, and he had spent 5 years cultivating this particular grief like a rose along a wall, and he stepped out of the shadow with his own weapon up and his own voice warm. "Rafael, my boy," he said it gently, the way he'd said 1,000 gentle things across a lifetime. "I'm sorry it came to this, I am. Sit down where I can see your hands. Your girl couldn't finish it, so I'll have to, and it's a mercy in the end. You've been dead 5 years already. I only had the courage to stop pretending first." And Rafael, at the peak of the worst thing that had ever happened to him, could not have managed a polished line if his life had hung on it, and his life did hang on it, and what came out in pieces. "You held her bird at the funeral." His voice broke on it. "You put it in my pocket at the graveside. You told me to keep it warm for her." He stood there in the falling gray with the man who had been his father in everything but blood. "You gave me back the last thing she ever made with her hands, and you're the one who killed her. You held me while I cried for her, every night for a month. You sat with me." "I did," Emilio said softly. "Someone had to. Sit down, Rafael." That was the moment, because Emilio, watching the dawn, savoring the ruin of the man he'd broken, had made the same mistake every man in this story had made, which was to keep his eyes on the wrong person. He had eyes only for Rafael. He had forgotten for 1 second to keep them on the blade, and the blade had not come through the door. The blade had come the way Serafina always came, the way the old man himself had spent a fortune teaching her, through the way in that no one thinks to watch. Through the loft window at the dark back of the barn, the one she had clocked from 300 yards out in the field in the first 10 seconds, silent, from above, from behind, the last knife you never see. And while Emilio held his weapon on the broken man and let himself have his moment, she was already inside the frame he'd staged, already down from the loft, already behind his 3 men in the shadow of the hay, and she moved. It was fast, and it was final, and it was hers, no one else's. She took the first man before the other 2 knew there was anyone in the room but the 2 they were watching. She took the second as he turned toward the sound the first one made going down. The third got a hand on his weapon, and she was faster. She had always been faster. She had been made faster by the very man now spinning toward her with the understanding breaking open across his old face. And she let him spin. She let him see it was her. She wanted him to see, and she put herself between Emilio Barsanti and the child on the bale, between the murderer and everything he had tried to take, and it was over in the space it takes frost to hold on a blade. The barn went still. Rafael was moving now too, coming in fast off the door, but there was nothing left to do that she hadn't done, and the old man stood alone in the middle of his own, staging with 3 of his men down and his weapons still up, and pointed at the woman he had forged, and no board left to move her on. "You forgot to watch the loft, Nero," Serafina said, and her voice carried across the frozen barn, flat and clear. You taught me that. Never let them see the knife. You never once let me see your face in 11 years, and I found it anyway. I found it on the arm of the man you told me to hate, holding him up while he grieved the wife you killed." The old man looked at her over the barrel of his gun, and whatever he had expected to find on her face, he did not find it, because it wasn't triumph. She had already turned half away from him. She had crossed to the bale in the same motion, and gathered the child up and pressed Paya's face hard into her own shoulder so the little girl would not see. And that, more than anything Serafina had done in the 4 seconds of the fight, was the thing that told Emilio Barcenti he had lost something he had never understood he was playing for. He had built a weapon, and it had grown a heart, and the heart was the one thing his 50 patient years had no counter for. "You could have been the finest thing I ever made," Emilio said, and there was something almost like grief in it. His gun didn't lower. You were better than any of them, better than him." His eyes flicked to Rafael and back. "Put the child down. Come here to me. It doesn't have to end with you on the wrong side of it, Serafina. You don't even know the whole of what he is, what his father was, what this family took from the world before you were ever born. I gave you a purpose. What has he ever given you but a fire and a lie?" "He gave me the bird," she said. And she moved on him. She did not use a blade this time. She used the 11 years he'd put into her hands, all of it, turned around and coming back, and it was close, and it was ugly, and it was quick. And the shot he got off went wide into the black of the loft. And then the gun was on the floor of the barn, and the old man was down on the frozen boards. And the 50 patient years and the 5 he'd waited, and the 11 he'd spent forging her were all finished at once in the white light of a cold morning, undone by the exact weapon he'd made. Which had finally understood whose hand had held it and had chosen, at the last, which way to turn. He wasn't gone yet. He looked up at the two of them standing over him, the frozen man he'd failed to keep frozen and the blade he'd failed to keep blind, and Rafael went down on his heels beside the man who had been his father in everything but blood, and he didn't gloat. He couldn't. His face was wet, and the hands the city feared were shaking. "Why?" Rafael said, "just that." And the old man told him because dying men sometimes do, and because he wanted the boy to carry it. It came out between wet breaths in pieces, and it was not the tidy speech of a man who has planned his last words. It was the truth leaking out of a hole. "Your father built it," he said. "Built all of it, and gave it to a child. It should have come to me. I made him what he was, and when he died it should have." Arya found the accounts. "She was clever, your wife, cleverer than you. She found what I'd been moving, and she was going to tell you." A breath. "So I moved her chair." His eyes found Rafael's and held. "And you wouldn't break. Any other man breaks, goes in the ground behind his wife, and I take the chair clean, but you went a stone, so I thought a slow knife, a patient one. There was a child on the street that night, the one you carried out alive. No one's perfect. And I took her, and I made her, and I pointed her, and it almost..." He coughed. "It almost worked. It would have worked on any man who ever lived except one who'd stopped to hold a door." Something that might once have been affection crossed the ruined old face. "You were always the better animal, Rafael. Everyone loved you and it cost you nothing. I could never stand you for it, not even when you were a boy." Then Emilio Barcenti's eyes emptied out, and the gardener's thick hands went still on the frozen barn floor, and it was done. 5 years of it. 11 years of it. Finished in the white light of a cold morning while somewhere below the field the sea worked at the rocks, patient, indifferent, taking its slow bites out of the world the way it had that night and every night since. They walked out of the barn into the risen sun, the 3 of them, the man and the woman and the child between them holding a hand of each, and that is where the city's version of the story ends, with the Don and his knife and the traitor on the floor, because the city only ever wanted the blood in it. But that was never the real story, and it never had been. The real story was 2 frozen people, and what came after the frost broke. It came slowly, the way a thaw comes, never all at once. The whole harbor knew the legend that the Cassano man had not touched a woman in 5 years, and the harbor had the reason wrong, the way a legend always does. It was never about the wanting. It was that he had loved one woman with the whole of himself and lost her in 2 seconds because he stopped to hold a door, and he had decided the safest thing a man could be was empty, and he had made himself empty on purpose and called it survival. And a girl had come up the service drive in a borrowed coat, and he had looked down and thought she was no one, and she had turned out to be the child he'd carried out of the fire, alive, grown, standing in his house with the last warm thing his wife's hands ever made in her apron pocket. And she had put that warm thing back into his hand and told him to hold on, the same as he'd once done for her, and the empty man had held on, and in holding on he had lost his grip on the only thing he had truly guarded for 5 years, which was not his body and never had been. It was his grief. She made him lose control of his grief. She made him set it down at last. That was the thing the lurid whisper of the story could never have guessed, that the woman who made the untouchable man lose control did it by handing him back the right to feel something and live through the feeling. And she, whom the world would have called untouched and would have meant one small and ordinary thing by it, had been untouched in the way that mattered a great deal more, a girl who had made herself a stranger to her own heart at 13, because a voice on a phone had taught her that wanting was a leak that drowned the mission, who had never once in 26 years let herself belong to a single living soul, sealed shut and loaded and aimed. And the man she'd been aimed at had turned out to be the one who carried her out of the fire, and in learning to love him she had to break the seal the old man had welded, had to become, for the first time in her life, a person who could be hurt, which is the only kind of person there is who can be loved. He made her lose control, too, of the mission, of the armor, of 11 years of obedience, and she chose it. She chose the terror of feeling over the safety of the blade, and that choice was the bravest thing either of them ever did, braver by far than the barn. They did not have a wedding the city would have recognized. Some months on a gray afternoon that neither of them would have called anything but a Tuesday, they stood on the seawall where the roses were, and Renata was there, and Nico, and Paya in a dress she had chosen entirely herself, and the boy Elio, well again now, holding his aunt's hand. Rafael took Serafina's hands in his own, and he said his vows, and they came out the way everything true he ever said came out, in pieces, rough at the edges. She held his eyes and set hers back level and clear, because that was who she was and who she would always be, and between their joined hands, pressed warm, were 2 small wooden sparrows carved by the same knife in the same hand, 13 years and 5 years and a whole life apart, side by side at last. They took the copy of the seascape down off the gallery wall and burned it in the grate, and hung nothing in its place, because people stop seeing what they own, and the 2 of them were done owning things that lied. Rafael found other ways to run the harbor, warmer ways, the ways the man he'd been before the fire might have found if the fire had never come, and the city noticed the Cassano name was said a little differently now, still low, still careful, but with something else underneath it, and no one could have told you what. Paya grew. Her mother stayed. The house that had run on hard clocks and silence filled up, slowly, with the noise of people who were no longer afraid, and the sparrows stayed on their ledges, dusted now by a hand that was allowed to move them and set them back, because grief that has been set down is not the same as grief forgotten, and the birds were not a wound anymore. They were just the birds she'd loved, kept by the people who loved him. On a winter morning a year on, cold enough to hold the frost on the grass by the seawall, Serafina sat on the low wall by the bare roses with a small knife and a piece of pale scrap wood, and she worked it the way she'd taught herself by studying the 2 birds she owned, turning it in her fingers until the shape came up out of the grain, a small rough sparrow, her first, lopsided and real. When it was done she found Paya, and she sat the child on the back step in the same house, in a different world entirely, and she closed the little girl's fingers around the warm new bird. His wife carved these, she said, and it was the first time she had said his wife and meant it as something that belonged to her too, and it was true now. All of it was finally true. And a man gave me one when I was scared, a long time ago, and it kept me alive until I found my way home to him. So now it's yours. And someday, when you find someone who's frightened in a way you can't fix with any words you have, you close their hand around it, and you tell them the only thing that ever helped. Paya looked down at the little wooden bird warm in her palm, and up at Serafina, dark-eyed and level and unafraid, and she said, "What do I tell them?" "Hold on," Serafina said. Down the wall the roses had come to nothing in the frost, bare and brown and cut back hard, the way they went every winter before they came back, and Rafael stood at the study window with his father's watch on his wrist, and the last sparrow Arya ever carved held loose in his open hand, warm from his pocket, and he watched his wife braid a child's hair on the back step in the risen light. And for the first time in a very long time, the man the whole city said in whispers felt his own pulse keep its steady time under his ribs, easy, alive, and did not need to swim until it hurt to be sure that he was still in the world.